you guys today about finding success in failure. It's something that we don't talk often about, but I thought it was a really important topic, particularly for early career faculty. We're going to understand the importance of failure in shaping success, and we're going to talk about strategies for how to rebound from failure. And I wanted to start with a very personal story about why I became interested in this. So I was an early attending, maybe 1 year out from residency. I had a toddler, and then I had a newborn, and my husband was completing his fellowship training. And a dual physician household working full time with 2 small children is no joke. I don't know how many of you have been in a similar situation, but it was extremely challenging. And now looking back in hindsight, I'm like, of course it was challenging. We're so busy. But I didn't really understand how challenging it was going to be. And I ended up taking time off from work. So going part-time after coming back from maternity leave, which had not been in my plan. I thought I was going to be working full-time forever. And really the second child sort of pushed me over the edge. And I ended up working part-time. And I was the first person in my department in like 20 years to go part-time. And that did not feel good. And then in terms of my academic career, it essentially ground to a halt. I didn't publish a single paper. I wasn't involved in any projects. I had wanted to be in academic medicine because I loved writing and I loved doing research, and I was doing none of that. I was simply just surviving. So I felt very much like a failure every single day in those, early career moments, and also in raising a small family. I just felt like I had failed in every aspect of my life that was important to me. And it felt really bad. And I didn't really have anybody who I could go to say, I'm really struggling. I feel like my career in academia has ground to a halt. I feel like I'm not doing what I want to be doing. I can't even work clinically full time because I'm so overwhelmed at home. And it felt very isolating and very lonely. And I think that once I emerged from that time, it made me realize how important it is to talk about these issues, whether it's, us feeling like failures in our personal life or feeling like failures in our clinical or academic life. But it also brought the question of, so I thought to myself, like, I just need to get through this. If, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I just need to get through this one day at a time. And there was no other option. I just felt like I'm going to just keep going forward and eventually something will change. But by doing all of this and by feeling this way, I also wondered, why did I care about success? I felt like I needed to work full time. I felt like I needed to be publishing. I felt like that was intrinsic to my success. But why did I care about success? And at this point, I really love to hear what the audience has to say, whether they have any insight about why they care about success or what success means to them, or whether they have any insight into why other people might care about success. And if you're one of those brave people who say, I don't care about success, kudos to you. I think that's amazing. But I think it takes a long time to get there. So I just love to hear from people in the chat, if you want to unmute or if you wanted to put in the chat box why you care about success or why others may care about success. So freedoms. Dr. Dua says freedom to choose. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit if you feel comfortable?
Absolutely. Let me unmute myself. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sakshi, and after a very painful struggle to get promoted from assistant to associate, which took a whopping 9 years for me because I was so lost, so diffuse, so directionless, and finally making it to professor, I have reached a point in my life where I have the freedom to choose to say yes and no to things I want or don't want to do, because I feel like I've reached a point where I no longer have to say that obligatory yes to all opportunities and can be more passionate about the projects I pick, and also like having flexibility. So to me, being successful means having freedom to choose the kind of work you want to do and not that you have to do.
That's amazing. And I think often we don't think about success in that way. That's a wonderful definition. In the chat, others have said, having a successful job means that you have a successful identity, because so much of what we do is tied into how we view ourselves. And then success provides self-value and a sense of accomplishment. And I really do think that that's exactly what we think about when we think about success. We think about recognition, right? That our peers, our colleagues, our boss is recognizing that we're doing amazing things. There's career advancement going from promotion, from assistant to associate. We get a confidence boost. And it's part of our mindset. I think for many of us, especially many of us in medicine and academic medicine, we're on this track, on this ladder, right? You go to the best college, you take the MCAT, you go to the best medical school, you match with the best residency program for you. And that ladder to success is just linear, and you just keep climbing because you never have a moment to stop and think, is this actually what I want? And over time, that becomes our mindset, right? The constant go, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. I'll be happy when I am assistant professor. I'll be happy when I am associate professor. I'll be happy when I am at X, Y, and Z school. And it becomes tied into our self-worth. We view ourselves as having value if we succeed. And I think that's intrinsic to many, many of us. And certainly this was the case for me as well. I wanted to contrast two quotes. The first is success begets success. I've been offered a lot of movies now that 30 Rock has been successful. And the other quote, which is diametrically opposed, success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. And because the talk about failure, I think you can guess which one resonated more with me. And it was the second one, right? That I felt certainly when I had the time and the wherewithal to look back and reflect on those early years of my career, that I had been used to success. I'd been very lucky. I had gone to great medical schools and colleges and matched at a wonderful residency program where I was very happy. And I just felt like my life was successful. And then when failure started to happen, I felt like I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know what it said about me, and I didn't know how to manage my feelings, and I didn't know how to manage the rest of my career because I'd never failed at anything before, really. And as I was constructing this talk, I wanted it to be more than just emotions and my thoughts, and I wanted to look into data. There's not a lot of data out there about failure, which is unsurprising, right? People don't like to talk about failures. But Wang and their colleagues did a study looking at the question, can an early career setback lead to future career impact? And it's a really interesting study. So they looked at two groups of people who they called near misses and narrow wins, and I'll explain what that means. So they studied junior scientists applying for R01 grants, and they looked at the two groups who fell just below the level of funding, so the near misses, and then the groups that fell just above the funding threshold, so the narrow wins. So literally they got funding by the teeth of their skin, right? And what they initially found was sobering. They found that for those people who didn't receive funding as a junior scientist, they had increased rates of attrition. So 10% of them would never win NIH funding. That is a sobering statistic. But then they looked at the long run, and what they found was actually very interesting. They found that in the long run, the near misses, so people who didn't get funding, outperformed the narrow wins, the people who did get funding. So let's take a deeper dive into their findings. When they looked at the two groups over a decade, so not just looking immediately what happened in that first year after missing or winning funding, they looked over 10 years, and they found that those people, those two groups, had the same number of publications over the next decade. What was interesting is that they looked at the first 5 years then, and they saw that 13% of papers from that narrow win group, the group who just barely got funded, were in the top 5% of papers cited. Sounds pretty good, right? But then they looked at the near miss group, and what they found was really interesting. In the near miss group, so the group that didn't get funding, just barely fell below the threshold for funding, they had 16% of papers in the top 5% of papers cited. 6 to 10 years later, papers published by the group that didn't originally get funding had nearly 20% more citations than the narrow win group. And for many of us in academia, publications and citations are going to be what makes our promotion pathway accessible, right? So this is really important data. They concluded it is the ones who failed that are more likely to write a high impact paper in the future. Okay, all of you are probably thinking, how did this happen? Why did this happen? This can't possibly be right. Those people got funding, these people didn't. What's going on? So there's one other study that I wanted to review with you. This is called Quantifying the Dynamics of Failure. It's a great title, and it's a great paper. And what these authors found is that it's not all about persistence. Meaning you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe those people who missed just kept trying, and they kept trying, and eventually they got funding, and eventually they got their papers published. But this study found that people who succeeded and people who failed actually tried the same number of times to achieve their goals. So both groups were persistent, right? Both groups worked really hard. They did the same amount of effort. But one group was more successful ultimately. What changed for that group who failed initially and then ultimately succeeded is that they learned from their prior failures and they learned quickly. So if they failed, they sort of dusted themselves off, got back on their feet and said, I'm going to try again. I'm going to see what did I do that caused me to fail? And what can I do that's going to change this trajectory and actually enable me to succeed? So what can I change? What can I do better? What can I incorporate that's new and novel into the work that already exists? And that way they picked themselves up, they learned faster, and they incorporated changes that made them learn from prior failures and ultimately led to their success. So when we think about learning from failure, there's three ways that we can think about learning. The first is we ignore it. We bury our heads in the sand. We say, I failed. I don't know why I failed. I don't want to know why I failed. And this is it. I'm never going to try again. Or we can say, I failed. I'm just going to start again and just forget about that failure and just move on. And the third way is probably the better way, right? Because the third way is us thinking, being, self-reflective, asking for feedback, saying, what didn't work in that attempt of mine? Maybe did I not do well in the interview for this opportunity? Could I have done better? Are there things that I should have said differently? Could I have explained myself and my goals in a different way? Then we retain what works. Imagine if your proposal for this opportunity was amazing. You're going to keep that proposal, right? But if somebody gives you the feedback, well, your interview didn't go so well, you didn't sound like you were interested, maybe you can work on that aspect of your proposal on your project. And then you're going to replace what doesn't work. You're going to say, okay, whatever I did for that interview just didn't work. I'm going to practice how to be more enthusiastic. I'm going to practice how to be more coherent. I'm not going to do this post-call, and replacing what doesn't work. So you're asking for feedback. And you're accepting that feedback, which is going to be challenging, right? It's hard to take feedback. You're going to retain what works. Again, if you had something that worked really, really well, you want to keep it. You don't want to throw it away. You don't want to start afresh because that's creating more work for you. And you're going to replace what didn't work, what caused you to fail, what dragged you down. Take that out and throw it away. So you can't be emotional about this. You can't want to hold on to things just because you wrote like 3 pages and you don't want to cut those pages down. You just need to move forward. This is really hard, right? It is really hard to fail. And I try to remind myself that there's 2 things in life that are inevitable. One is death and one is failure. And it sounds sort of morbid, but it's really true. We are going to fail. We are going to fail at some point in our life. And if we think about failing in an academic center or in an academic context, then we fail and we're sort of at a tipping point, right? We are facing 2 paths. We're facing 2 roads. One is the path that leads to stagnation, and one is the path that leads to progression. And that tipping point, it sort of determines, our response determines what we're going to end up, what path we're going to end up taking. So if our response is, I give up, I fail spectacularly, I'm never going to do better, I should just give up now, then we're going to be launched on that path to stagnation, where, the failure serves as a stopgap. The failure ends our career or ends this opportunity, and we never emerge. Or we could say, I failed, that didn't feel good, it was really bad, but let me see how I can make things better. That is going to launch us onto the path to progression. And that's where we want to be. And I want to give us a caveat that we're not going to fail and immediately say, okay, I'm on the path to progression, I'm going to go for it again. You might need a moment or 2 to sort of wallow at times, and that's okay. We need those moments to say, I'm human, I feel really bad about this failure, and I just need a moment to take a step back and reflect, and then decide whether I want to pursue a path to progression or not, and that's okay. But my hope is that through this talk, you'll realize that failure happens to all of us, and that we can take the time that we need to sort of rest, recuperate, recover, and hopefully then get on the path to progression. So when we're on the path to progression, what that means is that we're learning from our failure. We're asking those questions of, give me feedback. I'm going to retain what worked. I'm going to replace what didn't. And we're learning from our failures, and we're going down that road. And it's not going to be easy. There might be failures again in the future, and we might have to do multiple iterations of this proposal or project or interview or paper in order to actually end up being successful. But that's what the path to progression entails, and that's what it means, and it's worth it. So when we think about failing, we're all going to fail, but we need to figure out our response to failure, right? And that response is to fail faster and smarter. And what that means is this: when we fail, The response that you want to have is to say, okay, I failed. How can I make this better? You want to learn from your failure. You want to incorporate that efficiently into your next attempt to produce a high quality proposal or paper or project. And Wang and his colleagues found that the longer we wait between our subsequent attempt, the higher the risk of failing again. So really there's something to be said about failing and then thinking and reflecting in the moment to say, what could I have changed? What could I have done better? And let me get right back onto that and see how I can make this better. So don't allow yourself a huge lapse of time, because that will just increase your chances of failing again, or it'll just actually make you feel like you don't want to pursue this project further and it'll fizz out. But this is hard to do, right? To say I have failed, to acknowledge that, accept that, and then move beyond without feeling like that failure is going to be a stopgap in your career, that's really hard to do. And it takes this attitude of having a growth mindset in order to achieve that. And what does that mean? I'm sure many of us have heard the growth mindset attitude, but what it means is that taking failure not as the end of our careers, not as, the end all be all, but rather as an opportunity for growth, because we're always wanting to learn more. We're always wanting to be better. We're always wanting to continue to improve ourselves. And if we see failure not as the ending, but as a beginning, then it gives us the opportunity to learn. It gives us the opportunity to shift our framework around failure and to avoid self-blame, to avoid saying, I am so dumb, this is why I couldn't do this, or, everybody else has a family and is able to manage their academic careers. It's just me who can't do this. There's something wrong with me. To shift the framework and say, there's nothing wrong with me. Life happens, failures happen. I'm going to practice self-compassion. And when we practice self-compassion, we're actually thinking, what would I say to my friend? If my friend came to me in this situation, what would I say to my friend? And saying those words to ourselves, because there's nobody who's harder on ourselves than we are. And thinking and shifting your framework and saying, how is this failure going to make me better? Because this is a beginning, right? And I think thinking about this as a growth mindset, as an opportunity for growth, is what's going to be helpful. So I want to sort of give you a CV of failure, because I think so often we look at CVs and they're so impressive. People have done so much. I look at their pages and reams of publications and I think to myself, I could never do that. But I want to take that myth away, because for me, at least, and I know this to be true for myself, for every workshop that's been accepted at a conference, there were multiple abstracts that never got accepted. For every paper that I published, there were projects that never even got off the ground. For every grant I got, there were grants I applied for that I never received. And there were papers that sort of died before I could even get them out the door. Or there were papers I got out the door and then a collaborator said to me, oh, I didn't finish reviewing that. So, these failures happen. For every committee I sit on, there were committees that I really wanted to be on that I didn't get. And for every opportunity I received, there were opportunities that I didn't receive. And what really made me think more deeply about failure was a very interesting failure that I had myself. And that was probably a couple of years ago, I applied to this medical education fellowship. I'm really interested in medical education, obviously, APD for our residency program, which I love doing. And I thought, this is a really interesting opportunity. I'm going to be able to understand how to be a medical educator and be trained in how to be a medical educator in a way that I wasn't able to do earlier. So I applied for the opportunity. I made it to the interview process and then later found out that I hadn't gotten it. I said, okay, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to keep going. But I had the foresight to ask a mentor who sat in the committee for this fellowship, what happened? I made it as far as the interview process. What did I do wrong? And she gave me some feedback about my interview that I reflected on and took to heart. So I applied again the second year in a row and said, this year I'm going to get it. I had a really good project and I prepared for the interview and I made it again as far as the interview process. And then a couple of weeks later, I got an email and I hadn't gotten it again. At that point, I was at that tipping point, right? I was at that fork in the road where one path leads to stagnation and one path leads to progression. And I was on the way to stagnation. I said to myself, oh my God, I can't believe I applied again and still didn't get it. I give up. I'm not going to do this again. I mean, it was so humiliating to not have to apply twice and still not get it. And then the thought of having to ask my chair for a third letter for the same fellowship, it was just too humiliating to even consider. So I said to myself, I give up. I'm not going to do this. 6 months passed by and I thought to myself, I just got in this role as APD. I really wanted to be good at that role. I really wanted to understand how I could be a better medical educator. And I said to myself, I'm going to apply again. And this is the last time that I'm going to apply. So I practiced my interview. I actually redid my entire proposal for my project and made it more applicable broadly to graduate medical education in general and not just OBGYN. And I asked my chair for a third letter, and she did not judge me. And I just decided to launch myself on that path to progression because it was better to try and fail again than for me to not try at all. And I actually ended up getting the fellowship in the third try. And when I got it and I met the people who were my co-fellows and I understood what was going to be asked of me in that year, I realized there was no way I would have been ready for this a year or two ago. Absolutely no way. I brought my best self to the fellowship because I had failed. I'd learned from my failures. I had experienced different opportunities, and I was a different person than I was a few years ago when I first started applying. And I got a lot out of that fellowship that I don't think would have been possible a few years ago. And so for all of those people on this call who failed, I want to sort of give a happy ending. And that happy ending is that I ended up getting that fellowship program that I had applied 3 times for. I ended up getting a grant that I received that enabled me to do some research I was really interested in. I started publishing more and writing and realized how much I loved and missed writing. And I ultimately ended up getting promoted to assistant professor. And I still joke that, that promotion cost blood, sweat, tears, breast milk, and multiple years of my life. I think Dr. Dua had mentioned how it took her 9 years to go from assistant to associate. And I felt every one of the years that it took me to go from instructor to assistant. But I made it, right? And I think that I had been competing sort of with myself and saying, I have a timeline, I have a deadline, I need to be an assistant in the first 3 years after I graduate from training. And that didn't happen. And I had to be okay with that. But ultimately, I ended up getting to where I wanted to be. And I gained a lot more wisdom in that path because I had so many failures and so many moments of, is this actually what I want to be doing along the way? And so it felt very affirming when I ended up arriving in some sense. So what I would love for each of you to do, if you feel comfortable, is to think back to one failure that you had recently. And if you feel comfortable, writing in the chat what you learned from it or what you wish you learned from it and how you're going to incorporate what you learned in the future. So I'll give people a moment to do that. I know Dr. Dua has written, no experience is ever wasted, and I would absolutely agree with that. I think even when I haven't received opportunities, I've learned what I can do better. And Dr. Lautenberger said, I wasn't ready the first time, and when I got it, that was truly the right time for me to be the best at the opportunity. And I definitely felt that way when I finally did end up getting this opportunity, that I was finally ready. This is true in love life as well. I love that. And while everyone is sort of thinking and ruminating on this, this is my last slide, but I love this quote, that failure is success in progress. And I want us to think about this each time we fail, because again, failure is inevitable, but it's success in progress. Every time we fail, it is an opportunity. If we have a growth mindset, it is an opportunity that we can use that failure to learn, to grow from it, to become better, and ultimately to be happier, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing. I welcome